the Bold Republic Radio Show. My name is Glenn Woods. Thanks for joining me. And since it is a Thursday, we head on down to Cheyenne, where I believe this is Maureen patiently waiting on the phone. Is this you?
It certainly is.
Good to hear from you again. And I have, just so you all know, full disclosure here, been suffering from house envy. So how is that back lawn looking?
The back lawn is looking pretty good now with the rain.
Okay, good. Okay, because that stuff
I used to hate the rain because I lived in a place that was just nothing but a weed pile and that would just make the weeds grow. But now I've got a nice lawn, so I'm always praying for rain, and we're getting some. So
well, I'm going to re-ask this question this winter when you have to start shoveling snow off the walk in the driveway. We'll relive it all over again. So let's start with, because I was just sort of teasing it in the last hour when it came to people running for office and corporate welfare in the state of Wyoming, and you've been writing about this recently, haven't you?
Yeah, we've been writing quite a bit about it because we've seen a resurgence of this lately, in fact, in the last legislative session, but it's been happening more and more in this state. And corporate welfare is something that happens in every single state, and it's something that everyone needs to pay a lot of attention to because, I think if they really realized what was happening, they would start looking more closely at the candidates that are running for office and start punishing those that think it's okay for politicians to decide which businesses should get support by your money. Because that's essentially what corporate welfare is. It's the government and the politicians and the bureaucrats who decide, gee, we think that this particular business might be good, so they take your money and so take that investment decision away from you. They say, look, we know better than you where to invest your money, so we're going to invest in, say, for instance, ethanol, Solyndra, Enron, all these really great companies. These are the kinds of things that get funded by corporate welfare because essentially, in order for companies to really lobby to get this money diverted to them, they have to have a big lobbying arm. And in fact, Solyndra alone spent about $1.8 billion lobbying Congress and the president's and the White House basically to get about $535 million worth, $1 billion, worth of handouts, which they went and lost. So that's essentially one of the underlying problems with corporate welfare, is that they take money from productive uses and they put it into unproductive uses, and then it's lost. And that's money that's lost forever. And so it's not going to roads. It's not in your pocket to pay for maybe something you want, or maybe even something you don't want, like higher Obamacare insurance premiums. Corporate welfare is a really big problem, and it's something that's coming up quite a bit in our own primary season here in Wyoming, so I think it's something that people need to understand a little bit more about.
Well, now as I'm listening to you talk here, I'm thinking, well, you can't really have corporate welfare unless you have corporate cronyism and government cronyism at the same time.
Well, what corporate welfare really does is lead to the growth of this cronyism, because it's sort of like one of these chicken and egg things. Maybe not chicken and egg is not probably a good analogy, but it's one of these things that sort of feeds off itself, where you've got government that has more and more money, doesn't really know what to do with it, it wants to appear to be doing something, and this is one of the big reasons why I think politicians really talk up this corporate welfare or subsidies to business issue. They say, look, it's up to the government to start diversifying the economy or promoting economic growth, and they do it by trying to divert money from your pocket into the businesses that they think are going to make them look good. And so what you see when you see corporate welfare very often is that money going into these really big, high-profile, headline-making companies like Microsoft and some of these other companies that we see around. And that's sort of one of the underlying problems. And one of the reasons why politicians really seem to like corporate welfare, it allows them basically to use your money to buy your votes when really it's making you worse off.
And in most cases, I'd think that they're bringing in high-profile businesses because it makes them look good. But let's face it, it's mostly the small businesses that make any state, really, isn't it?
That's right. Most real jobs and value-producing and wealth-creating jobs are created in the private sector, in the unsubsidized sector. Obviously, they have to be unsubsidized because, if you've got a company feeding at the public trough, it's obviously not able to get money privately or independently, and maybe that's because it has a really bad idea, like Solyndra, for instance. So that's what we need to start looking at, is which of the candidates in the primary season are talking about corporate welfare and that it's a good thing, and which are the ones that are talking about corporate welfare and saying, look, this is really a bad thing, because those are the ones who are being honest with you.
Okay, I'm talking with Maureen Bader from Wyoming Liberty Group. Now, for those people who would make the argument, and I've had this argument made to me, well, these companies wouldn't come into our area unless we cut them some kind of a deal or paid them some kind of money. And my answer has been, well, what you're missing is the people of our state get to vote every single day on what companies are going to be part of this state when they reach into their wallets and vote by spending money with that company. So rather than government coming along and taking my money and handing it to a corporation that maybe I had a problem spending money with, I don't want them in the area, which is exactly what they're doing, why not let me vote? But they can't seem to get past that idea that these companies are not going to come to our area unless government woos them our way.
Yes, the unfortunate reality today is that every single government in every single state, pretty much, and even at the municipal level, use tax dollars to try to attract business. It's sort of a race to the bottom in a way, to try to bring these companies and these jobs, because what they're looking at really is the benefits, but they're not adding up the costs, because on the surface it might seem like a really good idea that you've got Microsoft coming into Cheyenne. They're going to spend millions and millions of dollars to set up a data center here, and they're going to create jobs. And the state was competing with a bunch of other states to attract them, so it was really important to make a really, really good package to attract that company. Now, the problem, though, is that when you start looking at, well, how much did it actually cost to do that? That's when you can say, well, hey, you know what? Let Microsoft go to another state, because we don't want to divert that much tax revenue from other areas, like, for instance, roads, or maybe schools, or maybe hospitals, or maybe something that people actually want, to this data center that, in fact, is creating very, very, very few jobs. I mean, the Microsoft's a huge company. Why is it playing one state off against another for handouts to come and set up a data center in the state, especially when you think about Wyoming, because data centers actually like to set up in Wyoming because of the altitude. It tends to be cooler, so its energy costs, which is something we'll get to in a minute, tend to be, at least for now, much lower. So why are we giving Microsoft what is essentially $500,000 per job to sit up here in the state, when we could use that money for something else? Or, in fact, if you go to our website, wyliberty.org, I've written a Liberty brief where I've laid out all of the tax breaks that this Microsoft corporation gets. You know, they get a break on the sales tax. They get a whole bunch of different kinds of breaks, and it adds up essentially to $500,000 per job. So taxpayers are actually paying $500,000 per job to attract Microsoft to the state. Now, did we maybe have some other use for that money? But more importantly, and this is where I think politicians really fall down on the job, I mean, if they really think that tax breaks or lower taxes mean more companies will come to the state, set up here, and create jobs, then, hey, why don't you cut those taxes for everybody? Mm-hmm. Instead of you picking the winners, let's as you said earlier, let's let the market pick the winners. Let's have a really low tax. What we really could do in this state is reduce the sales tax. Let's reduce the sales tax. Let's reduce some of these other taxes and some of the permitting requirements that Microsoft managed to get out of, just because they happen to be really big, high profile, and headline making. And instead of just having the government pick the winners, let's have the market pick the winners, just like you said, and we'll be a much better off state at the end of the day. We'll have higher growth, we'll have higher job creation, and even more importantly, we won't have energy hogs coming into the state at a time when you've got the federal government doing its darndest to jack up electricity prices, which is going to have a devastating effect not only on Wyoming families, but also on the small businesses that are actually the job creator, the real job creator, the wealth creator in the economy.
I'm talking with Maureen Bader from Wyoming Liberty Group about corporate welfare. Now, let's be clear. It's not just a matter of, well, they're going to get some tax breaks and money, Maureen. They're going to get a lot of expensive infrastructure that they should be paying for themselves.
Yeah, that's right. They get roads. So here in Cheyenne, for instance, we have this group called LEADS. And what LEADS does is essentially leverage tax breaks that it gets with some of its own money to then set up what they call I forget what they call them exactly, but they set up certain industrial parks. So they'll set up all the infrastructure. You can actually see if you drive out west of Cheyenne here, where they're setting up the third phase of this Microsoft data center. So you've got all these bulldozers in there. They're setting up the land for it. They're putting in roads. They're putting in electricity. Putting in water. All this infrastructure that they need, and that comes to the cost of taxpayers primarily. So this is an additional. I mean, you just need to add up these costs. It's just really crazy. And the other really, really ironic thing is that Microsoft, which uses a huge amount of electricity, the data centers use a huge amount of electricity. They get subsidy. They get their electricity costs subsidized. And this is the really crazy thing, because these data centers use right now about 2% of all the electricity produced in the United States. And even the Environmental Protection Agency, that we normally don't like for all kinds of different reasons, they did a report that showed that back in 2006, data centers used about 61 billion kilowatt hours of electricity, or about 1.5% of all U.S. electricity consumption. And that had doubled from 2006. So at the time, they said, well, if this continues at the same rate, by 2011, it will have doubled again. Now, of course, we had the big recession in 2008, which hit here more around 2010, 2011. And as a result, there wasn't a 100% increase. There was only a 33% increase in electricity consumption over 2006 because of the recession. So what's going to happen when the economy, one would hope anyway, eventually picks up? Well, what's that going to mean for electricity rates if those data centers really start to crank up? Well, it can really mean what we've done in our paper is show that it could mean, in fact, the doubling of electricity rates for families, or electricity costs for families here in the Cheyenne area. This is just a complete disaster.
Well, now I think that leads into the article that you wrote from Wyoming Liberty, which is the featured article on my reading assignment page today. Fuel poverty coming soon to Wyoming. Is that what you were leading into?
Yeah, fuel poverty. These things I just can't make up.
Okay.
Fuel poverty is a real term used extensively in Europe. What it means essentially is that a family is considered fuel poor if they have to use about 10% of their income to purchase fuel to heat their homes.
All right,
so if
hold
they're
that
not
thought,
able to,
because I got to pay some bills here so we can continue to keep the lights on in this building so you can finish this story. Back in with Maureen from Wyoming Liberty Group. She's on the phone right now. My name is Glenn Woods. Thanks for joining me. I want real quick, Maureen, before we get back into the topic, which I do encourage everybody to read your article, which is at yliberty.org or on my website in the reading assignment page. So we've been redistricted because of the past census, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I go to, and I was picking on this last hour, to take a look at the new districts. Okay, so my website is boldrepublic.com. Your website is yliberty.org. A government website reads soswy.state.wy.us/elections.
Holy cow.
Yeah, we're going to remember that, aren't we?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, okay. So anyway, let's talk energy poverty here before the lights go out.
Yeah, so fuel poverty is something that I think we're going to start hearing more and more about here in the United States, because it's already very common in Europe. What that means is that a family is really unable to heat their home sufficiently. The reason it's been such a problem in Europe is because of the green energy boondoggle. A lot of utility companies are forced to use very expensive wind power or solar power, and of course what that does is really it flows into the cost of electricity for yourself, for your family, and it jacks up your fuel prices. So we've seen a big increase in fuel poverty in Europe. So what happens here in the States, that's something that could potentially happen. We need to keep a close eye on it. But what we're seeing here in Wyoming in particular is this shift to attracting these big energy hogs like data centers into the state. What that is going to do at the same time as that we've got the federal government working to eliminate essentially coal from the energy mix is a big increase in the demand for much, much more expensive energy. If we take a step back for a second, what we really need to start thinking about is the electricity industry, because it's heavily it's what we've got here in Wyoming in particular are a number of private companies who essentially are supplying what is called, for some reason, a public service. But electricity is not a public service. And I mean, it's just because government has sort of taken it over that it's become a heavily regulated industry. And heavily regulated industries, just like government, respond to political incentives, not to economic incentives. So you've got these companies like Black Hills Power down here in Cheyenne who are forced to work through the government. And of course, we're forced as electricity consumers to utilize that monopoly company. So what happens is that then they're forced to respond to what the government is doing. What the government is doing, of course, is jacking up the cost of electricity by this war on coal. And so what we've got down here in Cheyenne, Wyoming, is a shift out of coal and into gas-fired plants. Now that might sound like something that's like ho hum, because the price of natural gas has gone down, but the price of everything else has actually gone up, so the price of construction and all these other things. So as we move away from coal, which costs about $10 a megawatt hour to produce, we move to natural gas, which costs about $53 a megawatt hour to produce. And if Black Hills Power were to shift entirely away from coal into natural gas, what I show in my Liberty Brief that you can find on our website, wyliberty.org, is that the cost of electricity for your family home would double. So what is going on here? If you look at this article that I wrote that's posted on your website, boldrepublic.com, what we see is something that really is a head scratcher. Companies that operate in the private sector, such as computer companies, for instance, what we've seen is a massive reduction in the price of computers. What we see in both government and these heavily regulated industries, as I've mentioned, is a massive increase. Now, why might that be? Well, maybe it's because in the private sector, you've got the profit motive, and so you've got entrepreneurs who are looking for ways to use technology to lower costs. Then what happens is that competition forces them to pass the cost savings on to consumers. But we don't have that. We've got these monopolies that we're forced to deal with. They don't have any competition, and they can just go and raise taxes pretty much any time that they feel like it. It creates an entirely different set of incentives. So what I went and did was take a look. It's one thing to talk about it, but let's actually look at the numbers here. If we look at a Mac computer, and I don't know, you're probably too young to remember this, but back in the late 80s,
I remember it.
I actually did calculus homework on one of these Mac 128K computers. It had a 9-inch black and white monitor, 128K of RAM, which is a huge increase over the 64K that I had on my computer at home. Mm-hmm. It had like 8 megahertz processor speed. This thing didn't have a hard drive.
Right.
Did not have a hard drive. And we're looking at something that cost about, in today's dollars, close to $6,000 if you adjust it for inflation. So now, what do we see today? Well, you have a 21.5-inch color screen. If you look at an iMac, a great, huge color screen, 8 gigabyte of RAM, 2.7 gigahertz processor, a 500 gigabyte hard drive as opposed to a 0 gigabyte hard drive. And then it costs just a little bit over $1,000. So for about 1/5 of the price, we get a computer today that's twice as large, 62,500 times more RAM, can process over 300 times as many operations, and it has a storage capacity equivalent to about $400,000 1984 floppy disk. Now, you probably don't remember floppy disks, right? Those great big ones?
I'll be 50 in October, so I think I remember the floppy disk.
Okay, so you remember the floppy disk. You don't even have those anymore, right?
No, we don't.
I mean, if you had to buy that many floppy disks back in 1984, you would have had to pay in addition to the cost of the computer, $2 million. Wow. And so as a result, what we see today is just about anybody who wants to can have a computer. But what we're facing in these regulated industries is families that may not be able to afford the cost of heating their home.
Huh?
This is a real problem, and this is something we need to look at more in depth in the future.
Thanks for coming on, Maureen. I got to run.
Always great to be here. See ya.